Hi everybody, welcome along to this recording of the very first session of Salt and Light, which we ran in October in the parish. And the Salt and Light events, for those who don't know, who might be just joining us for the first time, they are monthly in-person formation nights where we take a deep dive into the Catholic vision of reality, and then from there we sort of launch out into some of those, perhaps you might say, more challenging issues related to our faith, but the questions of the Catholic moral vision. We also explore questions around suffering and evil, and some of those things that come up in conversation where perhaps maybe we are a little bit unclear ourselves, or maybe not even sure how to respond when people who are outside of the church pose questions to us. And so what we're doing over these first couple of sessions is we are laying a bit of a foundation, and this recording is being made available for those who missed the first session, who A, want to catch up, or B, might want a little taster and then get themselves signed up and come along to the next sessions, which are going to be happening basically until August of next year. And they are once a month on a Thursday night. So not a huge commitment, but one that I'm sure you'll find rewarding. And also, you get the benefit of a bit of refreshments and community and fellowship before we start each session. So without any further ado, let's dive into the first session. And the topic that we are covering in this session is, I'm calling it Foundations Part 1. And there's going to be 3 Foundations sessions. And this first one, Part 1, is exploring the issue of identity and meaning. And in particular, what we're doing here is we are contrasting the Christian vision of reality with what you might call the typical secular vision of reality, which tends to be the predominant way most people would think about these questions of identity and meaning, whether they realize it or not, in our Western secular culture as it currently stands. Before I go any further, though, the most important thing I'm going to say to you is that all glory goes to God for anything good you receive in the session. All the rubbish, that's my fault. Please God, you will forget it very quickly. For those who don't know me, this is my wife, Katie. We've been married for 21 years. You probably see her around the parish. And I obviously have been in this parish here, based out of and living out of Rangiora now with our family for, I'm just trying to think the number of years it's been. It's been a while anyway, and we've got 5 kids. By the way, the reason why Australia is so disproportionately small compared to New Zealand in that map is I do a bit of work in Australia, and I like to remind our Australian brethren of our ego and how we see ourselves in relation to them. I had the privilege of being in Australia a couple of weeks ago to speak at a conference when New Zealand won the Bledisloe. So that was quite a joyful experience. As I said, we've got 5 kids. You might be familiar with some of them. If you're in our parish, you will have seen them around the place. I have a contractual obligation to my children, actually. Wherever I go, they say, Dad, you've got to show them a photograph of our cat Ignatius. So this is our cat Ignatius. And finally, the reason why I am delivering this series of presentations in the parish is because for the past 20 years, I've been working full-time in Christian ministry, and I founded a charitable organisation, an educational Christian ministry called LifeNet New Zealand. You can find out more about what we do at lifenet.org.nz. But basically, in a nutshell, our focus is about promoting and planting the seeds of leadership, virtue, and ethical concern through goodness, truth, and beauty, that Christian vision of goodness, truth, and beauty. What does that mean practically? It means that I spend a lot of time travelling around New Zealand and Australia, speaking at churches, schools, conferences, universities, and other events. As I said, you can find out more about what we do at lifenet.org.nz, but I've been doing this now for 21 years, as of October 2025. And one of my big focuses is on this question of culture and understanding what's going on in our culture and what you would say is the Christian counterculture. What's the difference? That Christian vision of reality, how does it look, smell, taste, sound, and feel differently? First of all, just to give you a quick introduction about Salt and Light, we are going to be gathering once a month, as I've said. There's 3 sessions in 2025, the rest are in 2026. The focus is that hopefully it will help you to grow in your knowledge and also in your faith. It will enliven your faith and help you to grow in your knowledge of the faith. The upcoming dates and topics will be announced at the end of each monthly session, in-person session that we have in the parish, and also in the parish bulletin. And I'm going to make PDF slides available for every session that we have. And also from this point onwards, there will also be audio recordings of each session available. So if you do happen to miss one, the idea is to be there in person. That's where all the magic happens. But you can catch up by getting the slides and listening to the audio version. Alrighty, let's jump into this first session, Foundations, Part 1, Identity and Meaning. And what we're really talking about here is anthropology. Anthropology is basically a very academic way of saying what it means to be human. Like, what does it actually mean to be a human being? How do we flourish as human beings, live a full and meaningful life? How do we find meaning in life? What is a good person? What is real? What is reality? What is morality? All of those kinds of questions are wrapped up in this question of human anthropology. And so to understand who we are is quite essential if we're going to live a full, flourishing and meaningful life. Because if you get that bit wrong, then you'll start on down a path that actually isn't going to enable you to flourish as a human person and is almost certainly going to do you a lot of problems. One of the challenges that we've got today in our modern culture is that basically we are now living in a society with competing visions of reality and human anthropology. So if you find yourself having conversations with people at different times, and these are people who are outside the church, might be friends, family members, co-workers, and you think, man, it just feels like we're speaking a completely different language. In a sense, that's what's actually happening. There is a completely different anthropology and understanding of what it is to be human, a completely different vision of reality that is almost certainly at play. And so when it comes now to having a conversation about some of the big issues, the moral questions, the questions of God, faith, existence, and all those kinds of things, we really are at times speaking different languages. This problem is made worse by the fact that today a lot of people wrongly believe that only religious believers have bias. So basically there's this popular idea in our culture that if you're not religious, then when it comes to the big questions about God and about meaning and about, big moral questions, moral issues, I guess the hot topics of our age, then if you are not religious, you don't have religious faith, then you're objective. If you are religious, you've got bias. This is absolutely untrue. Everyone has bias, and this is a key point to remember out of all of this. Everyone has bias. So the question is not, do you have bias? Because you do. Everyone does. The question is your bias good, true, and beautiful or not? The other problem that we're dealing with here is that a lot of people today have all sorts of bias on board. They have a vision of reality, a worldview, and they don't realize just how loaded that worldview is and the fact that they're carrying around this worldview. And secondly, they have no real concept, a lot of people, of where that worldview came from. And this is quite a unique moment in history, actually, because even if you go back to the medieval period where you encountered illiterate peasants, they understood where their worldview came from. They might not have been able to do theology or write great works or anything like that, but they could articulate, it comes from the church, it comes from Christ, it comes from the scriptures. They could tell you why they believed what they believed. And a lot of people today, as I said, have this ignorance that they don't have any bias when they do, and then the bias they do have, they don't have a clear sense of where it's actually come from. So there's sort of like this dual ignorance at work. And this often creates even more of a problem because when we're having conversations about faith with people who don't have faith, as I said, there's this false perception that maybe somehow they're being more objective, whereas those of us who have faith are not being objective when that is clearly not true at all. Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And what he meant by this was not that, if you're not constantly navel-gazing and thinking about your own life, it's not a good life. What he means is basically that if you don't have some higher and deeper first principles that govern your life, that direct your actions, then you can't really live the fullness of the human experience. You can't really live life. Instead of living life, you will be dragged along by whatever happens to be the strongest given force at any given moment in your orbit. So it might be, for example, the government. If you're living in Nazi Germany and the state says to you, we want you to report your Jewish neighbors. If you are living an unexamined life, you will just follow along because whatever happens to be the most powerful thing in your orbit, you'll just go along with that. It might be your passions. It might be lust or greed. and these things might drive you. And basically what happens is you end up being dragged through life by these outside external forces, and your life tends to be superficial. You don't really live life to the fullness. You don't really flourish as a human being. So it's important to have some underlying first principles that actually govern our lives. And that's really what we're going to unpack in this session. These first principles around identity and meaning that Christianity gives to us, which are actually quite essential for us living a full and flourishing human experience. The question I think it's worth considering in all of this is, in light of what Socrates has told us, is, well, what is informing the shape and the trajectory of our lives? Why are we heading in the direction that we're heading in? What gives shape to our lives? Why have we constructed our lives the way that we have? Because there is a big question here, and increasingly the demarcation, if you like, between the Christian vision of reality and the typical, and at times very aggressively agnostic or atheistic secular vision of reality. There is a clear demarcation here. On the one side, we have Christ who says things to us like, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. It's pretty bold kind of statements and claims to be making. He also tells us that I've come to give you life to the full. So that's on one side of the equation. And then, of course, we have a competing vision of reality on the other side. We have St. Paul who tells us in the letter to the Philippians, have the mind of Christ. So in other words, use the mind of Christ. Think about the world and think about your actions. So this is, I guess, his version of Socrates' unexamined life. He's saying, don't live an unexamined life. Live a life where you put on and see the world through that lens of Christ, through the mind of Christ, and then act accordingly. So this is hugely important. As I said, there's these huge competing visions of reality here, and increasingly more and more the demarcation between the two, the distinctions are getting quite stark in some places. And so and also I think maybe even costly at times. Sometimes to remain faithful to a Christian vision of reality, it might cost you things. It might cost you popularity. It might even cost you employment opportunities. I know people in that very situation. And we're not talking about people who are hostile or nutty or anything like that. We're just talking about people who are faithful to some of those fundamentals of the Christian vision of reality. And so it is important to understand and to consider and to contemplate and to live that examined life, not the unexamined one. So in order to do that tonight, let's jump in by looking at some of the hallmarks of the modern secular anthropology, the vision of reality, and the human person, and in particular where they came from. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at three key hallmarks. And we're going to look at some more in the next session, and then in the following session in December, we will complete this sort of foundation series by looking at a few more. And so the three that we're going to look at tonight, we're going to start with the first of these, this typical hallmark of the secular anthropology, the way people would view their lives, or possibly not even realize they're viewing it. Again, this can be a very subtle but powerful thing where they have imbued a sense of what they think reality is. They don't know where it came from, and they might not have even contemplated the fact that they have this idea about what it is to be a human person, but they often will act based on this vision of reality. And the first of these hallmarks is that it is a disembodied anthropology. I'll explain this in just a second, and so you can understand what's happening on the screen here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these three different hallmarks of your typical secular anthropology. On the left there, as you see, secular. And then on the other side, what I'm going to do as we go, I am going to explain the Christian difference. How is the Christian vision of reality different? And these are key differences, and they really do have a profound impact on how we see ourselves and how we act in the world. So the first is this idea that we are disembodied, that human persons are actually not really their bodies, or our bodies are kind of separate to us in some way. Or maybe you might hear people describing the body as a machine, or I've heard people commonly refer to it as a meat suit, rather brash colloquialism. But basically this idea that human persons are perhaps a soul, we might say today a consciousness, self-awareness, those kinds of things. Where did this idea come from? Because it's not a neutral idea, and it's certainly not objective, and it's certainly not something scientific either. It's an ideology. An ideology, by the way, is where you take an idea and you will impose it upon reality. We often use that word ideology today as if it's interchangeable with belief or doctrine or philosophy. In actual fact, there's really different things going on there. With philosophy, you start with what is real, and you ask the deeper why questions. Why are things the way they are? So you examine the mystery of reality, if you like, ever more deeply. But you start with what is real. With ideology, you start with the idea. And then, if you have to, you will even try and break reality to make it fit with the idea. So that's what ideology is. It's a little bit different. And so what we're dealing with here is an ideology. And it comes to us courtesy of the philosophy of René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650. His famous saying, of course, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And what Descartes is doing here is he's responding to a question that is being asked at the time, and that is, well, how do I know that I'm really here, that I actually exist? And his answer is simple, but profoundly true here in this case. He says, well, if I am asking myself the question, how do I know that I really exist? I'm thinking, therefore I must exist. Because if I didn't exist, I wouldn't be here to ask myself that question. Do I really exist? Quite simple, really. But what Descartes goes on to do is he creates a vision of human anthropology which is flawed and false. And it is what we call today Cartesian dualism. Cartesian, as in his last name, Descartes, and dualism as in two. And what he does is he splits the human person into two, and he says that the human person is not actually their body. Their body is like a machine, and instead he says that the human person is a soul. We are a soul that inhabits a body, and the body is like a machine. If you've ever seen any of the Men in Black movies, there's one film, I can't remember which of the films it is in particular, where there's an alien that looks human, looks like a normal human being until the head opens up and you see a tiny little alien at the controls in what looks like, well, what previously looked like a human head. This is a great metaphor for Descartes. According to Cartesian dualism, you're that little alien, the little soul, and your body is a machine that you inhabit. Now, there are various versions of this today that play out in our culture, but this idea really stuck and had some very serious and, I would argue, certainly from the Christian vision of reality, some very negative impacts upon Western society. So, first of all, this has profound implications for knowledge, because how do you know anything that you know about the world? All of the knowledge you have about the world has come to you via your 5 physical bodily senses. In other words, your body transmits the knowledge, or receives that knowledge, we would say. In the Catholic vision, Descartes would say it transmits it to you. You know, you're a soul, remember, who inhabits the body, but you're not your body. So the key question is, how do you know that your body is telling you the truth when it gives you knowledge about the world? Because according to Descartes, you're just a soul. It's not that you can step out of your body and check that everything's functioning as it should and that the machine's calibrated correctly. And so when you look up and see a blue sky, that it is actually blue and not black or something like that. And so there's this massive problem that starts to creep into Western thought around skepticism that becomes increasingly irrational, to the point where now we've got to a situation where there are people who will literally say things like, I don't believe anything is knowable for certain. And of course, that's a contradiction, because if nothing is knowable for certain, then how can you know for certain that nothing's knowable for certain? It is a contradictory, self-refuting proposition, but it's one that's out there. Another example of this would be people who are writing academic papers now claiming that we are living in a virtual reality simulation. We think we're really here, but we're not. This is not physical, they claim. They claim it's like the Matrix. Our bodies are stuck in a machine effectively, and this is all playing out in some virtual kind of world. This sort of hard, irrational skepticism creeps into Western thought as a direct result of this sort of separation of the human person from their body. It leaves the world basically with this idea of persons without bodies, and I'll give you very clear examples of how this impacts the modern way of thinking about issues in our world and how this plays out in a very tangible way. So first of all, think about the issue of abortion. It's not unusual to hear people claim that they don't believe that you are a human person in the womb because you haven't yet developed consciousness or self-awareness. That's not a scientific idea, and it's certainly not neutral. It's Descartes' idea, because what they're expressing there is the belief that a person is their consciousness and that their body is not part of their personhood. So therefore, when you're in a womb, before you've developed consciousness or self-awareness, they would claim you're not really a person, and therefore, obviously, that has an impact on the morality of abortion in their minds. They think it would be morally acceptable because you're not doing harm to a person. We're going to explore that specific question at a future session when we look at loving our unborn neighbour and the church's teaching on this and why that position is not correct. Transgenderism is another one today. You have people today saying things like, I was born in the wrong body. That's a Cartesian idea. That's Descartes in action. I'm not really my body. I was born in the wrong body. Sex, when you hear people say things about human sexuality like it was just a physical thing. It was nothing more than that. In other words, we engaged in the sexual act, but it was just a physical thing. In other words, what they're suggesting here is that somehow it was just two human bodies, but not two human persons who engaged in the act. And of course, the increasing push for us all to live in the virtual reality. There's all sorts of variations of this idea that we can live a virtual life and that we will find our happiness and our completeness, as if somehow our bodies don't really mean as much, or they're secondary, or we could live a full life without our bodies because they're not really that essential to who we are. In response to this, the Christian vision of reality would say, no, in actual fact, we're not disembodied, we are incarnational. Now, incarnational, obviously, the most common time we hear that phrase is in relation to the incarnation. Jesus, who is God. God becomes man. God takes on human form. That's the incarnation. It's why when we say those lines in the creed that we bow during that part of the creed, because this is the most important and central mystery and truth of our Christian, or one of the most essential and important truths of our Christian faith. The incarnation, God who becomes one of us. In the Christian vision of reality, God is not some distant solitary being. And when God says that he knows us, God really does know us because God lived the fullness of the human experience. He lived tiredness, he lived suffering, he lived our challenges. And that's a profound thing. It's an intimate relationship that the human person can have with God as a result of this. So that's the incarnation, but we are incarnational. We are souls incarnated in our bodies. And the church would want to say to us that, like Catholics, we're not materialists, so that's the opposite of Cartesian dualism, would be to say, well, you're not a soul in a body, you're not a soul at all, you're just your body. In other words, your material parts. That's not the Catholic position. Instead, the Christian tradition says that the human person is a unified whole of both body and soul. Technically, in the technical language of philosophy, this would be described as hylomorphism or hylomorphistic dualism, but you're a unified whole of body and soul. A great example of this, by the way, this is just a self-evident truth. I mean, when you sleep at night, you do not cease to be a human person. But when you sleep, you have no consciousness and no self-awareness. You have no free will. You do not do anything exclusively human. You have no higher order personal human faculties when you sleep. You effectively become a body, living and breathing and going through the motions that are beyond your control. You wake up 8 hours later and you don't even realize 8 hours has passed. But you don't cease to be a person when you sleep just because you are no longer conscious. But what that means and what that points to is the fact that you are actually a person. Your body is part of your personhood. That it's not simply about having consciousness. It's not simply about self-awareness. It's a unified whole of both body and soul. When my grandfather on my father's side passed away, he had dementia, and I went to see him in the final hours of his life. He was under palliative sedation, and his breathing was beginning to rapidly increase and become more shallow as the body was shutting down. And I spent a good bit of time with him, and I held his hand, I talked to him, I stood by his bedside. That was my grandfather. That wasn't just his body, that was my grandfather. And this is profound when you think about the mystery of the incarnation too that we've just talked about. God who takes on human form. And we believe, obviously not just in the incarnation, but then comes the resurrection, this belief that God, in the person of Jesus Christ, is bodily resurrected from the grave. He doesn't leave the body in the grave and go, oh, thank goodness, I'm rid of that meat suit now, I can get on with life. He rises with that body. That's a powerful statement about our humanness and our bodies and how important they are. Then, of course, we believe that he ascends to the right hand of the Father with that body. Now, that's a profound statement. I don't know if you've considered this. This is a profound theological reality about human anthropology. Our humanity is now elevated into the very life of God. It's not something that Jesus wants to be rid of. He embraces it, keeps it, and elevates it into the very life of God. That's how important our body is. That's how important our humanness is. And then, of course, we believe in a final bodily resurrection. So in the Christian vision of reality, our soul lives on after death. We have an eternal soul, but that's not the end of the story. There is a final resurrection. We say this every time we say the creed. We profess this belief in a final bodily resurrection, body and soul, a new glorified body, and we will be united with body and soul because that's the way God intended it to be. It's also why we reverence the body, even when someone has passed on. Like in the Catholic tradition, if you have someone in your family cremated, the ashes are not supposed to sit at home on a mantelpiece, for example, or in a cupboard somewhere. They are supposed to be interred on consecrated ground. And so we reverence the body. Even those who have died, we recognize there's something important. Graveyards are consecrated sacred space, for example. The human body does matter. It is part of the human person. Okay, so disembodied versus incarnational, or unified whole of body and soul. The next of the traits of your typical secular anthropology is this idea that we are autonomous. We are autonomous, self-choosing individuals, and that's really how we tend to see ourselves in the Western world in a lot of different ways. Where does this idea come from? Well, it comes to us courtesy of Enlightenment liberalism. And Enlightenment liberalism, the scholars have different dates that they agree on. They have consensus on about when it begins and when it ends. The two that I've chosen that I quite like are 1637 for the start point, which is when René Descartes publishes his Discourse on the Method, and then 1789 is the end point, because that's the French Revolution, and then we see the Reign of Terror that comes on the back of this, and we see what can happen when the fruits of the Enlightenment liberal ideology are really lived out and the disastrous implications of that. And it was almost like a prophetic warning of what was going to manifest and unfold in the West over successive generations. The Enlightenment liberal philosophy is given to us courtesy of a group of Western thinkers, and these are some of the main protagonists, if you like, in that particular story. Scholars far smarter than I have made what I think is a very astute observation about these men. They were all childless. And I think this is important. So Immanuel Kant, Thomas Hobbes, Benedict de Spinoza, and John Locke, and of course we would include Hume in that, they never had any children. René Descartes had one illegitimate daughter who died of illness before she turned 5 and never had any more kids. Jean-Jacques Rousseau infamously had 5 illegitimate children to his mistresses, and then they were all abandoned to orphanages at a time in European history when it was widely understood, certainly by someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a self-taught genius, that to be abandoned to an orphanage in your infancy really was about an 80% chance that you would die. And so what these other scholars point out is that these men who were childless, who never knew the demands and the authentic community of family life, and they didn't give themselves to a religious vocation either, these men left the world with a bachelor philosophy. And what do bachelors do? They tend to put themselves at the center of everything. Now, we're going to go over just the key tenets, the 4 key tenets, just a quick summary of Enlightenment liberalism. You don't need to dwell on this too much, and it's not like you need to remember all of that, but I want to show you this because I want to have highlighted some key words, and I want you to see what's going on here, how this philosophy plays out in the world. All people are created perfectly free and equal by nature. Number 2, political obligation arises from the consent of the free individual. Government exists, number 3, due to the consent, again, of a large number of individuals, and its only legitimate purpose is to enable these individuals to make use of the freedom that is theirs by nature. And number 4, these concepts are universally valid truths that each individual can derive on their own if they only choose to do so by reasoning about these matters. Now, first of all, that point number 4, which is one of the central planks of liberalism, this idea that human persons will just reason their way to truth if you unshackle them from all the restraints. That has clearly, I think, been proved false now. I mean, you just have to log on to the internet for a couple of hours, pick any day of the week, and you will discover pretty quickly that, in actual fact, human beings left to their own devices don't really tend to reason their way to goodness and truth. There's no guarantees that will be where they'll end up at all. And so it's a lot more complicated than what liberalism would like to believe. Part of the problem here is that liberalism has a flawed anthropology, a flawed understanding of the human person. And then this has big ramifications because liberalism is pivotal for setting up the West as we know it today. Not the Christian aspects. There's a lot. What basically liberalism does is it steals a lot from Christianity. It borrows a lot from Christianity, but it tries to carry on without Christianity. And people often wrongly think that liberalism created the West. In actual fact, it isn't. It's a moment in Western history. But what we know today, and in particular the collapsing order that we see around the world, if you listen to the news and you think, what the heck is going on? It really is the liberal order that is collapsing. And the reason being its anthropology is flawed. And this particular point here about reasoning the way to the truth, we've seen the disastrous fruits of that really since the end of World War II, when America and other Western nations in particular have tried to live this out at the end of a gun barrel. So the theory is if you can get rid of the dictator in a country, then people will start reasoning their way towards truth, and they will, of course, want secular liberal democracy. That's really how the theory goes. But consistently what we see is that's not the case at all, and a lot of lives have been lost trying to live out point number 4. The latest example of this failure would, of course, be Afghanistan, where this, at the end of the Afghan war, clearly they didn't rush towards secular liberal democracy. Instead, they looked at what the West is doing and what's going on there, and they didn't find that particularly appealing at all. They wanted tradition. They wanted the religious heritage. They wanted the local community, etc. This in a nutshell, though, is Enlightenment liberalism. As you can see here from these key words that I've circled, it's about the individual, and it's about them choosing for themselves. In a nutshell, it's the idea that you are an autonomous, self-choosing individual before anything else. And this idea of the person should be really put at front and center of our societies, and the way we think about ourselves and the way we structure our societies. And you, as an autonomous, self-choosing individual, you decide for yourself what is true and what is real about family or work or gender, etc., etc. If you want to call 2 pot plants and a cat a family, then who's to say that's not a family? Because you're an autonomous, self-choosing individual. If you want to look at a pile of rubbish in the corner of an art gallery and claim that that is a beautiful thing, then who's to say it's not beautiful? By the way, that particular institution, which is literally just a pile of household rubbish, on at least 2 different occasions now, cleaners have cleaned up that installation after hours because they're obviously not as clever as the art critics. And they have come into the art gallery and they've seen a pile of rubbish and they've thought, there's been a party, a celebration, an event here, and this is the rubbish I'm supposed to clear up. They've recognised it for what it is. But basically this plays out in lots of different ways in our culture. Wherever you hear the phrase, my body, my choice, this is the Enlightenment liberal view of the human person and of society, really, and how it should be structured. The autonomous, self-choosing individual should be considered first, and government really sort of wraps around that idea. There's also this belief, a very important one, that no prior tradition or community can lay claim to the individual. So the idea being that you're not born into some tradition. That's something you have to choose for yourself. Even the most important of all communities, the family. The idea would be, in the liberal vision of reality, and you see this play out in policy, by the way, today. This is why a lot of policies treat young children as if they are independent, autonomous, self-choosing individuals, even though they might be young children, as if they exist separate to their own family. Policy consistently treats children like they should be treated as not being part of a prior community, the family, the first and most important of all communities. And so this is liberalism playing out at a policy level. So in response to this idea, Christianity would say, okay, we are individual persons. We're not a collective or a Borg of some kind, a hive mind. We are individuals, but our nature is not as liberalism claims. Instead, our nature is communal. And this is really important. And this stems from a couple of different things and it sort of plays out in a couple of different ways, you might say as well. So first of all, in the Christian vision of reality, we are made in the image of God. But in the Christian vision of reality, God is not simply a solitary being. God is a trinity, a community of 3 divine persons. The Father engaged in an eternal act of self-giving love. But for love to be love, it has to be reciprocal. It has to be received and returned in equal measure. And the only person capable of receiving the fullness of God's love and returning it in equal measure is Jesus, the Son. And the love between the Father and the Son is so profound, it is a person. We give it a name. It's the Holy Spirit. Every time you say that line in the Creed, that where the Holy Spirit proceeds from the love between the Father and the Son, this is what we are enunciating. This is what we are saying. So if this is God, and we're made in the image of God, and God is a community of three divine persons engaged in an eternal act of self-giving love, then that has big implications for our own anthropology. It means, first of all, that we are made for community. Secondly, it means we are made for self-giving love. Today, we tend to think of community as a nice thing, a pleasant state to be in, an enjoyable and a helpful thing to have. We think of self-giving love as a good thing to do, but in the Christian vision of reality, it's much more serious than that. In the Christian vision of reality, we would say, no, the human person, community is essential to their flourishing. Self-giving love, you are made for that. And if you don't do that, you will not find your life. You know, the unexamined life, well, Jesus says, if you don't first lose your life, you don't lay it down, you cannot find your life. There's a paradox here. So community is essential. Self-giving love is essential. They are not just secondary things. They're not just nice things to have. They are essential to our human nature, and we will not and cannot flourish as human persons if we are denied these things. And certainly if we're denied them long enough, we will actually devolve. I think about a prisoner locked in solitary confinement for long enough. Most people in that situation, they don't remain static as a human. They certainly don't become more fully human. They actually, if you leave them there long enough, there's a pretty good chance they'll go mad. The human person is not made to be alone. And when you think about our human nature, of course, it becomes pretty evident that we are communal by nature. I did not bring myself into existence. The first and most important of all communities, actually the family, brought me into existence, my mum and my dad. I do not sustain my own existence, particularly when I'm first born, for example. I cannot clothe, feed, hydrate, shelter, or care for myself. I need community to keep me alive. If I get sick, or I become infirm, or as I age, I need community around me to care for me and to sustain my existence. And I cannot flourish without community. I need at least one other person to know as friend that I can give myself to and discover the fullness of what it is to be human. And even more importantly, to have lots of other different, human beings around me and interacting with that diversity of sort of human emotions and human behaviors and human personalities. I actually learn a lot more about my own humanity in the process. So I can't flourish without community. And so we are actually not radically autonomous, self-choosing individuals at all. We are communal by nature. Community gives rise to us. Community sustains us. Community enables us to flourish. So to say that we are independent of community is really a nonsense. It's fundamental to our humanity. Not just that, but so are things like prior traditions that were given to me without my consent. And without those things, those prior traditions that are given to me often without my consent, I flounder and society ends up in crisis. Yes, there are certain things, obviously, where ideally I should be reasoning my way to the truth. The church doesn't reject reason. In fact, Pope John Paul II wrote a very important encyclical called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, and described the two as essential and indispensable components of the human experience and the Christian walk as a disciple of Christ. But there are also lots of things I don't reason my way to. They were given to me without my consent. So, for example, virtue in my life as a child. I was raised and I was formed and I was shaped by parents who did not ask my consent to hand on these fundamentally important traditions to me. And often I didn't even really fully understand. When I was younger, I thought, that's not fair, or that's not kind, or, mum and dad don't know what they're talking about. But in actual fact, I look back now and I realize they were spot on. So these ideas I didn't fully grasp, I didn't reason my way to, and I was given without consent. But without those traditions, I flounder and I don't become a responsible member of the community. In fact, if the situation at home is bad enough, I could end up becoming a reprobate, a criminal who's doing harm to others in the community because I haven't been given these traditions. I haven't been raised properly without my consent. What this shows us is that the liberal anthropology is actually flawed, fundamentally flawed in how it sees the human person. As I said, what we're living through right now is really the collapse of the liberal order. And the reason why it's collapsing now, because people often say this, well, how come it lasted so long? If it's not true, Because there certainly are some liberals out there, diehard liberals, who will claim right now that all we need to do is recover some good old-timey liberalism. Often they would say classical liberalism, which is a bit of a misnomer because classical liberalism doesn't really have much of the classical tradition embroiled in it. But they'd say if we just discover a more pure form of liberalism and get back to that, we'll be fine, we'll be right as a society. But that isn't the answer. Liberalism has been tried and it has failed us, basically, in a nutshell. And that's what we're starting to live through now. The reason why it was able to survive as long as it did was because basically liberalism tried to keep the fruit from the tree of Christianity without tending to the tree. And what it did was the good stuff in liberalism, so there's some false ideas about the human person, and there are some truths in liberalism as well. And the truths and the good stuff that you see is taken directly from the tree of Christianity. But then what it does is it adds in some ideas that are not true. And then on top of that, what it also does is it basically is operating within a society that has been deeply imbued and formed and shaped by the Christian tradition, not by liberalism. And so that residue lasts a while. It takes a while for it to sort of finally peter out. And initially, liberalism is carrying on and ultimately in a Christian society doing its thing. But then liberalism, as time passes and the cultural memory of Christianity fades and we move further and further away, there's a de-Christianization of our heritage that goes on or the way we have structured our society. Basically what happens is we really failed to grasp where the fruit came from. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where we want that good fruit, but we're not sure where to get it from. Liberalism became increasingly hostile to Christianity and it didn't just sort of live alongside it. Often it was actually taking an axe to the roots of the tree. And again, you can get away with this for a while until you sever the taproot. And then once the tree's dried up, where do you get the good fruit from? Not just that, but another thing was that we also failed to recognize that liberalism was just as doctrinaire as the alternatives that it criticized. The idea that people tend to put forward is that liberalism is perhaps more neutral. It's an objective state of humanity, that we're all just meant to be liberal and it's the natural state and we discovered it and we broke free of those superstitious religious shackles of the past and this is the enlightened. I mean, it's called the Enlightenment for a reason. This is the enlightened way to live your life. And in actual fact, it's not neutral and it can be very doctrinaire and in fact, it can be very illiberal at times. It is a worldview. It's a way of thinking about and seeing the human person and societies and it's loaded with all sorts of ideas and assumptions. And in actual fact, it can be very doctrinaire. And the problem, of course, with this is that basically anyone who offers critiques or criticisms of liberalism's flaws, which the Christian church does and has, finds itself in a situation where they are accused of being doctrinaire themselves as if liberalism isn't. They are accused of perhaps wanting to embrace some sort of dictatorship or authoritarianism or theocracy, some sort of religious tyranny, when in actual fact, that's not the only other alternative on the table. This is a bit of a false dichotomy. It's not liberalism or communism. It's not liberalism or, religious dictatorship. Those are not the only alternatives on the table here. But the way that we've thought about liberalism and failed to recognize that in actual fact it is quite doctrinaire and it is not a neutral worldview and not a neutral way of setting up your society means that we've failed to recognize, I think, and be as critically examining of in our reasoning about liberalism as we should have been. There's more of that happening now, but that's really because things are collapsing and it's becoming untenable and increasingly it's sort of inescapable that there are problems here that are quite serious. Liberalism basically has left us without a shared conception of the good. And this has created a major existential crisis. Where do I find meaning? Liberalism says, well, just go and find it for yourself. You make it up for yourself. Find your own truth. There's no shared concept of the good. It's also left us with a demographic crisis. We just haven't had enough kids. We haven't seen higher goods for what they are, like the good of family life and the community of a nation and, things like this. Instead, we've tended to prioritize self and self-interest. And now we're in a demographic crisis globally. We just haven't had enough kids. And so there are huge ramifications coming in the next couple of decades on the back of that. Most countries now, sub-Saharan Africa is the one that is sort of bucking the trend, but everywhere else around the world, what you're seeing is they are not actually at replacement fertility levels. They're not replacing themselves. This is why superannuation, like the retirement age, is going up, because basically there's not enough young taxpayers coming in to pay for that system and to keep it at 65. So there's big ramifications. That's one of many that are coming on the back of this demographic crisis. And it's also led to a great societal crisis. Liberalism tried to create a society that was secular in nature. It for the first time ever, this had never happened in human history. We tried to build a society that was not coalesced around, that did not have as its centre a sacred, transcendent religious truth which ordered and governed and was considered privileged in that society. And as a result of that, basically what we're seeing now is that, I think if you're an honest person, you have to admit that what the proof in the pudding points to is that you can't actually have a functioning society that is formed around anything other than a sacred religious idea. We see this very clearly, actually, interestingly enough, in different cultures that move into the Western world. So you have these Islamic enclaves where they've held firmly to their religious tradition, and what's happening? They're strong, they're thriving. They're not trying to live as sort of autonomous, self-choosing individuals in little silos. They have a sense of a shared existence together, and it holds them together very strongly. There are other examples too, but in the West, we're in a bit of a crisis as a result of this. This doesn't mean that we have to, as I said, enter into some sort of theocracy and become people who are living under some sort of religious tyranny or religious dictatorship. But really what the West needs to recover, I believe personally, is that it needs to recognise that pride of place should be given to the Christian tradition, and also the Christian tradition and the Christian tradition alone should be privileged in certain ways in Western society and legislation. So we should open our parliament with prayer every day to remind ourselves, at the very least, even if you're not a Christian, of that tradition and heritage which shapes our vision of reality, and that prayer should be Christian, because that is our tradition. We should also, I think, there should be privileges that are extended to the Christian church to enable it to help and to foster Christianity, because it's so essential to the healthy flourishing of Western society. And so, these are the great realities that we have to grapple with. There's no easy answers here, but this is the reality of what the West is dealing with at the moment. One last thing before we move on. Basically, the Christian concept of freedom is quite different here too. So in the liberal conception, freedom is the freedom to do whatever you want. In the Christian vision of reality, authentic freedom is the freedom to do what is good, true, and beautiful. And here's the important paradox. When you submit yourself to what is good and true and beautiful, you actually don't find yourself enslaved by that submission. You find flourishing. You actually grow in your flourishing. The research now tells us that people who have lots of options on the table in front of them are often less happy than the people who have less choice in front of them. They feel a greater sense of freedom despite having less choices in front of them. A very concrete example of this was in my own married life. When the priest called us up the front for our practice on the night before we got married, my wife and I freaked out a little bit inside. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm getting married to this one woman for life. Am I really ready to do this? And I freaked out a little bit about that. If I could go back in time now, I'd tap myself on the shoulder at that wedding practice and say, look, relax. This is going to be one of the most liberating and freeing decisions that you ever made. By committing yourself exclusively to this one woman for life and no others, and taking all the other options off the table, you will discover a level of freedom that you never thought possible. You will really flourish as a human person as a result of this. And it's a paradox, but it is profoundly true. I can't remember who it was, but one of the American founders, I think, who said that freedom is only a good horse to get on if you've got somewhere to ride it. So in the Christian vision of reality, just pure freedom is not necessarily a good in and of itself. It must be directed towards what is good and what is true. And as I said, when we submit ourselves, we flourish. A good way to explain this would be to think about the example of a piano. And there's a couple of ways you can play the piano. One is you can take a liberal approach where you say, well, I don't have to accept these prior traditions. I don't have to submit myself to your outdated laws and rules. I'm a liberal. I will figure this out for myself. I will play it however I want to play it, whatever makes me happy. I don't care. I'm going to put my fingers on different notes and I'm going to call that a D chord. Doesn't matter whether they are the right notes or not. That's what I'm going to do. It's my truth. I'm living it. I'm going to use my feet. I'm going to have lots of fun bashing away on this thing, making noise. Here's the thing, though. You can do that, and you might get some temporary pleasure out of doing that, but you don't really have freedom. Because the other way to approach a piano is to say that there is a prior truth here. There's a way of playing the piano which is actually good and true and beautiful. And if I submit myself to that, don't just do things my own way, but I submit myself to putting my fingers in the right place, to embracing those prior traditions, to delaying my gratification and practicing my scales, etc. What happens over time? The more I do of that, this is the examined life, by the way, the more I do of that, the more I truly flourish at the piano. I can now play music. I can now play beautiful Bach and Beethoven and jazz and R&B. I can even begin to compose my own music. My freedom grows by submission, not by doing whatever I want. And that's a really good metaphor to explain the Christian difference when we think about freedom versus the liberal one. We have the fact that we are disembodied, and we would say, no, we're incarnational. We have the fact that we are not autonomous. We are, in fact, communal. And the third and final of our modern, very typical secular traits when it comes to identity and meaning is this idea that we are self-creating. We create meaning for ourselves in the world. In fact, in some cases, people would even say we create the world itself. Where does this idea come from? Well, it comes to us courtesy of this guy here, Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the Mustache of the Year award multiple times in the 1800s. Friedrich Nietzsche is an interesting man. He went from being the pastor's son to the Antichrist, a label that he proudly wore. He grew up, there's stories of him as a young boy sitting in the choir loft. His father was a minister, listening to the choir in this Protestant church and being enraptured by it. And by all accounts, he was on a similar trajectory himself. But then his father contracts an illness and dies a very difficult death, and his own brother dies as well. And this has a profound implication for him. His philosophy is absolutely shaped by his pathology. His mind has a profound shaping on his philosophy, his view of the world, his own personal suffering and experiences. We see this commonly with a lot of philosophers, or none of us is exempt from this. And basically, he then embraces a open and militant hostility towards Christianity, to the point, as I said, where he's wearing the label the Antichrist quite proudly. In his work, The Genealogy of Morals, he starts by basically blaming the Jews for inventing moral conscience as a way to equalize their status in relation to their superior pagan neighbors, whom they were resentful of. So he says, look, the Jews are weaker, their pagan neighbors are far superior, they're resentful of them, they can't get even with them otherwise. So what do? They start saying, well, there's a God, there's moral claims and obligations you have, and, we can judge others worthy or unworthy accordingly. Now, with a statement like that, you'd think that he was anti-Semitic, that he's actually not. This is one of the great ironies of Friedrich Nietzsche. He abhorred anti-Semitism. But here's the thing. After the final 11 years of his life are spent, he goes insane, and they're spent in a mental institution. Before he's even dead, his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, has started bringing people on like almost pseudo-religious pilgrimages of the family home. This is where Nietzsche wrote his, genealogy of morals. This is where Nietzsche wrote The Madman, and it's almost like a religious experience for people. Then after he is dead, she publishes his final uncompleted work, The Will to Power. And The Will to Power was in note form. We don't know what the final shape of it would have been. Some of the pages had shopping lists written over the top of notes. So, this is the condition it was in. But it is published posthumously. Now, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche was a National Socialist. She was a Nazi. And so what happens is The Will to Power is taken by the Nazis and used as like the philosophical basis for their Nuremberg rallies, with the pillars and the torches and stuff like that. That they embrace this, their will to power. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But as I said, Friedrich Nietzsche almost certainly would have found this abhorrent because he was opposed to anti-Semitism. So he's not being anti-Semitic here, but what he's doing is making a statement about what he believes to be a problem in the world, and that's the problem of weakness and a failure to recognize the importance of strength and power. Now, he goes on to say that Christianity is even worse because Christianity promotes what he calls a morality of the slaves. And so Christianity has this focus on mercy and compassion, which he equates with weakness. And he says, who needs to be obsessed about mercy and compassion? The slave does. Why? Because they're weak. Who doesn't care about mercy and compassion? The master, because the master is strong and powerful. They don't need to trifle themselves with such silly things. So for Friedrich Nietzsche, Christianity is not just something he disagrees with. He thinks Christianity is morally evil. because he claims Christianity has done great harm to society by weakening society with its vision of reality and this focus on compassion and mercy. And he doesn't pull his punches. Let me quote to you from his own works. Christianity is the greatest of all imaginable corruptions, the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever yet existed, the most repugnant kind of degeneracy that civilization has ever brought into existence, the only unquenchable infamy of mankind. Tell us what you really think, Friedrich Nietzsche. No punches pulled there. So he doesn't just disagree, he sees it as a moral evil that has done great harm to civilization. And what he says is, instead of this master-slave morality, we need the Übermensch, the overman, the strong man, the superman, which is literally, by the way, where that comic book character draws his name from. The strong man who is not afraid of strength and of power, he is the one who is fulfilled and who leads us forward. He says the pre-Christian pagan cultures celebrated and worshipped strength. Christianity he sees as being hostile to this. And what he says is that basically those pre-Christian pagan cultures, they were great. They are the model that we should follow. And so the Übermensch, the overman, the strong man who takes power for themselves, he is famous for declaring the death of God in Book 3 of what was back then called the Gay Science. It's now been rebranded to the Joyful Wisdom. God is dead and we have killed him, he boldly declares. And there's two aspects of this. One is that he's celebrating the death of God because he sees this as now paving the way for us to become the new gods now. We will create for ourselves. But there's another way in which he is very insightfully aware of the problem here, because he is, unlike some of his confreres and even some people today, he is astutely aware of the fact that the Christian vision of reality is what shaped the West. And so without God, where are we now going to get our morals from? And so this is the promotion of the Übermensch and the strong man, and it's in the place of God. This is why Nietzsche is critical of the Enlightenment thinkers as well. You guys are talking about principles and truths and other things as if these are objective realities that can exist independently of God. But there is no God. We've killed him. There's this famous passage where he talks about the sun. It's no longer shackled in the sky. It doesn't have to rise in the east and settle in the west. It can go wherever we want it to. We are the new gods now. He's hostile to both Christ as the representative of the Christian religious tradition and also Socrates to ethics. He wanted to rehabilitate the worship of Dionysus, the god of passion, as opposed to Apollo, the god of reason. And what Friedrich Nietzsche leaves the West with is this idea that power is good. In fact, it is a god. And there's nothing new about this idea, by the way. This is the very fundamental fatal sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. You'll be just like God. You'll be all powerful. So power is good. It is a god. It is something that we should strive after and we should utilize. He's not a nihilist. He's about self-creation. We are the new gods now. We create for ourselves in our own image. And how influential is he? Well, if you said to me, Brennan, who is the one thinker that is most responsible for shaping the modern secular West? I would say to you, it doesn't really work like that. There's a series of thinkers and things that have all come together at once to create what you might call a perfect storm. But if you put a gun to my head and said, pick one, I would say, well, it's really Friedrich Nietzsche is the one that probably springs to mind as being most pivotal in all of this. You see, and you'll see this in future sessions of Salt and Light, Friedrich Nietzsche's thought just pops up in all sorts of places, even where you might not imagine it popping up. To give you one example, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, once said that I have to stop reading Nietzsche because I'm afraid that if I don't, I won't have an original idea of my own to give to the world. So that's how pivotal Friedrich Nietzsche has been. His thought, and it's prevalent and it's present with us today in lots of different ways. So if we are not self-creating, then what does the Christian vision of reality say? It says that we are created by God and we are recreated through baptism in the image of Christ. So first of all, the Imago Dei, the image of God. Genesis 1, chapter 27, the first book of the Christian scriptures and the Jewish scriptures. Genesis means beginnings, the book of beginnings, chapter 1, verse 27. In the image of God, he made them, male and female, he created them. Psalm 8, the book of Psalms, Psalm number 8 says an amazing thing about our humanity and the importance of it. What are human beings that you think of them, O God? You have made them a little lower than God. So in other words, in the Christian vision of reality, God is the pinnacle, but just below God is humanity. That's how fundamentally important our human dignity is, and we are as human persons. This is the Imago Dei, the image of God, what it means to be made in the image of God. And there's lots of flow-on effects we'll talk about in future Salt and Light sessions. There's big implications for this. But we don't create ourselves. We are created in the image of God. And therefore, if we find out more about who God is, then we discover, like community and self-giving love, how we can flourish. It's a terrible burden to place on someone to say, go and create your own meaning in the world, create yourself. We have people now caught up in a great tragedy where they are literally, think about something like Descartes, I'm not my body, I was born in the wrong body. And then you have Nietzsche together, and they are now trying to recreate their own body and their own image. It is a terrible burden to place on people. And then, of course, we believe also through our baptism, as this little fella here is finding out, we are recreated in Christ. There's something profound about our dignity. There's an elevation, a beautiful thing that happens there as well. Basically, in a nutshell, Friedrich Nietzsche was wrong. Good Friday is not the ultimate failure or weakness. That's how he would see Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Instead, it is an act of the greatest power the world has ever known. It is total abandonment to self-giving love. And as we know, it is profoundly fruitful. There is not a more powerful incident that has ever happened in the story of humanity. One of the profoundly and beautiful, important things about this Christian vision of the Imago Dei, that we are created in the image of God, is the profound implications that Christianity brings into Western thought and Western life. And really, when you talk about Western culture and Western society, you really are describing Christianity. It takes it to its fullness. And it's this idea of moral equality, this idea that we are all equal image bearers. You see this, St. Paul talks about this in Galatians. In Colossians, he also talks about it. The letter to Galatians and the letter to the Colossian church as well. St. Peter says it at another point in the book of Acts. Here's the Galatians version. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. In other words, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. It doesn't matter what your state in life is. It doesn't matter about your gender. Everyone is morally equal in the eyes of God. No one is morally superior to anybody else because of those characteristics. This is a radically different and a massive departure from the pagan world which Nietzsche celebrated. In the pagan world, even the pinnacle of the greatest of the pagan philosophies and philosophers and societies, the Greeks and the Romans, they didn't believe in moral equality. They still believed that people were born into a hierarchy. Some people were born into a higher state than others. And sure, you could find your happiness in those lower states, but some people were just born higher than others. The Christian vision of reality says no, that we are all morally equal in the eyes of God. And we are, regardless of our ethnicity, regardless of our state in life, regardless of our gender, regardless of our age. This is why we see an end to the practice of infanticide in the West. You talk to any non-Christian person today, agnostic or atheist, and you ask them, do you oppose infanticide? They say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, 99.9% of them will say to you, of course, it's horrible, it's evil. That moral instinct is not neutral, it's not objective, and it didn't come from the Enlightenment. It certainly didn't exist in the pagan world. It comes to us as a direct result of Christianity, following on from the Jewish roots of the Christian tradition. And we see this actually with Abraham and Isaac when they go up the side of the mountain. And it's one of these important scriptures where we think about human dignity. The scholars tell us where, Abraham at the last minute, as he's about to sacrifice his own son, God says no. And God says to him, God himself will provide the sacrifice. Now, obviously, there's a ram, horns are caught in the briars, and that becomes the sacrifice, this animal. But there's also like a profound moment of a messianic prophecy here too, a prophecy about the coming Messiah. God himself will provide the sacrifice. Jesus becomes the sacrifice on the cross, and this is pointing to that. But the scholars also tell us something really important is happening here that we often miss. This is God saying to the Jewish people, you are not to sacrifice your own children. This is not my way. And this is important because this points to the fact that even children have human dignity. And in the ancient world, that's not how children were viewed. So there's this sense of moral equality that shapes the West, and we all take for granted today, but it is a direct result of this profoundly wondrous and beautiful Christian vision of reality. So there you go in a nutshell. We are not disembodied, we are incarnational, we are not autonomous, we are communal by nature, we are not self-creating, we are created, and we are recreated. In the next couple of sessions, we're going to carry on and unpack a little bit more of these foundations. And what we're going to be talking about is in November, we're going to be talking about who are we and what are we here for. So who are we? What are we for? And then in December, morality, truth, and technology. Now, I know that might seem like a strange combination to put together, but I think by the end of it, it will all make perfect sense to you. Hopefully you've enjoyed this session. If you have, please join us at the future Salt and Light events. And maybe if you've got friends or family, bring them along as well. They don't need to be Catholic, Christian at all. This is a journey that we're going on of understanding and exploring, and at the end of it, hopefully people will go away with a deeper sense of appreciation for the beautiful richness of this Catholic tradition, this vision of reality, and how fundamentally important it is. Even if it's not something that they've embraced just yet, even if they're not at the point where they're thinking about conversion, hopefully they'll have a greater appreciation for this tradition that has profoundly shaped the Western culture in which we find ourselves all living. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you hopefully at a future session of Salt and Light.